Happy new module day. I would like to introduce the Neóni, which is a 12 HP, all analog, through-zero frequency modulation capable oscillator with a good few tricks up its sleeve, which make it quite a versatile sound maker and sound processor and modulation source, all the fun stuff. This video is going to be on the long side, so I'll keep this introduction short. Some people may have noticed that there was a minor leak of the product description and product shots of the Neóni a little ahead of the scheduled launch date. And it became a little bit clear that thru-zero is a bit of a controversial topic, which for some reason, a lot of debate as to what true through-zero frequency modulation is versus through-zero phase modulation or through-zero amplitude modulation. So I'll be breaking things up into clear sections in this video, and I'll give a dedicated focus on what exactly through-zero frequency modulation is and how it can be used creatively in patches musically, and why it's cool. So if you want to jump ahead to that, you can skip ahead to the 56-minute and 52-second mark in this video to learn how this module behaves when you modulate it through 0 hertz. So yeah, let's dive right in. I hope you enjoy. Cheers. Let's start with the more traditional side of the Neóni. I'm going to start with the top right switch in the traditional mode and LFO disengaged. We'll just go through some of the more basic ins and outs of the oscillator. There's the square wave. No real surprises there. I'm going to keep this waveform patched to channel 2 on the Mordax, and then that way we can visualize the other waveforms a bit more consistently. I'll move down to the triangle here, just because it's essentially the core waveform of the Neóni, with it being a triangle chord oscillator circuit. So the benefit of having a triangle core circuit is that the triangle really stays pristine across its entire frequency range. So if I take the scope down to 50 microseconds, see that even in the much higher range there, the triangle remains completely unchanged in its clarity. This really helps keep a very clean, consistent sine wave across the full frequency range as well. So regardless of if you're in really low LFO territory or way up in the higher frequency stuff, it's a very nice, clean, consistent wave shape. This is where things get a little bit less traditional. You can see the sawtooth wave has this wave shaping control beside it. And what this does, it allows you to offset the balance between the two halves of the waveform. So the way that the sawtooth is derived is actually from the two ramp halves of the triangle wave. So you can see the first half of the sawtooth wave coincides with the positive direction half of the triangle, and the down ramp is actually inverted and then offset to produce the sawtooth wave. So with the wave shaper in the fully anti-clockwise position, this gives us the original phase of the sawtooth, which you can see starts at the positive jump of the square wave. If I turn it to the center, we actually result with a twice frequency, half amplitude sawtooth wave of the original fundamental. And then if I push it through to the clockwise position, we're back to full amplitude, original frequency, but the phase is now offset by 90 degrees. You can see the ramp's actually starting on the down jump of the square wave. So this gets much more interesting when we start to dynamically modulate this with CV, which we'll get to shortly. But first I'll jump down here to the wavefolder and show it off a bit. So for anyone that's familiar with any of my previous oscillators, you'll know that I sort of continually tweak and play with the wavefolder designs between each implementation in different modules. So the first wavefolder that I implemented was this one here on the toner, which I still think is one of the smoother sounding wavefolders that I've produced to date. It's got that nice classic West Coast squelchiness to it. But you'll see that the actual real peak-to-peak amplitude of the waveform doesn't occur until you're in that much higher range when the thing's much more saturated. So coming back to the new guy, you'll see that the signal amplitude remains much more consistent across the majority of the range of the wavefold depth control. I've tried to keep everything on this oscillator's output much more consistent in output amplitude, so everything's at much more consistent 10 volts peak to peak or thereabouts. So even when you're folding the wavefolder in comparison to the sine wave, everything stays a bit more consistent. Pulling it to the negative position, and it does drop a little bit below unity, and likewise on the outer extreme it will push up a little bit past. But what I was going for was keeping things really consistent when you are modulating through that wave shaping range, so it stays a much more consistent amplitude. With something like a nice slow triangle wave from the oct, or even the triangle from an L4 ranged Neóni, we've got a nice smooth timbral shift without any sudden drops in amplitude at any positions. Jump over to some manual CV just to sort of show the CV range a bit more directly. So if I invert this and now send negative CV to the wavefolder, you'll see that it will actually close completely, which is a little different from a lot of other wavefolders, and the CSL can get quite low, but this is a different circuit for the VCA stage that's controlling the signal amplitude into the folder. So it will quite abruptly drop down to nothing, but it can be quite an interesting effect, especially if you're running at higher rates of modulation. So what you might have noticed with the CV input and attenuator on the Neóni is before it graphically goes to the wavefold depth control, there's this little slide switch. So what this does is allows you to route that CV as a more general purpose CV input to control either the wavefold depth, or we can actually control with CV the variable sawtooth wave shape. If I set my sawtooth to the centered twice frequency amplitude position and modulate that with a slow LFO, you get that nice gradual shift in the fundamental harmonic coming and going as it's attenuated out during that split point. What's also quite useful is with external CV, if you push the range past that of the wave shaping pot, you can actually extend that split further and increase the amplitude until you're getting almost like an offset square wave. So it allows for some more dramatic wave shaping control. So let's get things a bit more musical. So far this has just been static waveforms. I'll mute that just now. Okay, so to get something a bit more melodic, I'm going to go with the good old undersampled LFO trick through a sample and hold here, and see where that's sitting. Something a bit more periodic than just sampled white noise, and I'll quantize this down to minor pentatonic. Should keep things a bit more melodic. I think that's a good starting point. Okay, so let's try some patches using these new wave shaping methods. Let's run things through the 1047 and see what sort of timbres we'll get. Here's a more traditional resonant low pass filter sawtooth wave. And I can drop out that fundamental harmonic by centering the wave shape. Try a few interesting things here. I'll use the clock from the harmony here to clock an ADSR, and let's use this as a striking decay envelope and use that as our CV source over the sawtooth shaper. every time the envelope strikes, it's actually shifting this wave shape towards the central twice frequency half amplitude position, which almost sounds like sidechain compression. Increase the release time here. The character of the filter is not really changing. Resonance is staying consistent, cutoff frequency is not changing, but there's definitely a sort of amplitude pumping. If I bring up the decay, because the full amplitude of this envelope is now much higher, we're actually getting into like a square wave territory. Yeah, if I bring up the sustain so that we've got a higher amplitude signal. So if we view this version of the signal more directly, we're pushing the CV well into, you know, a saturated square wave territory. So that's hard clipping at the you know, the range of the op amps in the circuit effectively, but we're turning this sawtooth wave into a square wave, and with that going through the 1047, which has got the built-in limiter, which is a tan H wave shaping on the input. That's going to keep things reined in a bit. So we're accentuating every note with driving it into square wave territory. Try something on the more subtle side. Instead of enveloping the sawtooth split, I'll go back to a more regular LFO modulation. We can even repurpose our envelope here and use that to strike the filter a bit. Now we're steadily morphing from more of a square wave territory through to the missing fundamental sawtooth to traditional sawtooth. Increasing the rate of modulation, and we get a bit more of a almost a chorusing type effect. A little bit more movement. So already it's a much more interesting foundation subtractive voice than if you're using a more static sawtooth on another traditional oscillator. Try the same sort of tricks with the wavefolder here. I'll keep the filter more consistent here, with just rolling off the high end a bit without any resonance. And let's switch our modulation down to the wavefold depth. So it's the regular LFO modulating the timbre of the wavefolder. try using the envelope signal and see what it sounds like when we pluck the wavefolder. Even with quite shallow modulation over the depth, where it's just bringing those peaks in a little bit, you get quite a nice percussive character to the note strikes, and that can get as aggressive as you want. Patch and our envelope back to opening the filter. And then change out our modulation source for something that can go into audio rate. Quite a nice way of getting a more sort of vocal formant character, similar to audio rate FM over cutoff frequency on a resonant filter. I think this particular patch configuration has its own unique character on the Neóni, especially compared to some of the other wavefolder featured oscillators, because of this, the bipolar nature where it closes on the negative. Bypass the filter just now. You see, you get that that beating that's quite typical of audio rate AM. That's not 4 quadrant, so it's muting on the other half of the cycle. Nice range of timbres here. Let's dig into the sync capabilities of the Neóni. You can see there are actually these 2 sync input jacks, as well as a toggle switch, which defines some parameters of the hard sync in particular. So this has got hard sync with direction control via that toggle and separate soft sync input. So if we start with hard sync, I'm going to visualize or monitor the sine wave, and that will give us the most, the biggest contrast between a nice soft single harmonic overtone and the clock signal, which I will be pulling from the second Neóni. So I'll actually patch this via the scope on the second channel so that we're locking our new clocked signal to that, and we'll be able to visualize things much more clearly. So as you can see the blue signal is our clocking signal. I'll move that down a bit just so it's a bit more out the way. We've got more clarity over the primary signal. So the Neóni does what I'm referring to as directional hard sync, and that's through the choice of this toggle switch. So if we imagine what most traditional hard sync implementations are, it's a sawtooth wave where on a clock signal, the sawtooth ramp will always reset to its lowest peak and then charge up on every clock cycle. The Neóni being a triangle wave, it will always hard sync to 0 volts, and the waveform effectively has a choice of whether it charges up or charges down. And with this toggle switch, you get to make that choice for it. So if I have the toggle in the up position, this means that on every rising edge signal, the triangle wave, in this case the sine wave, will always reset to 0 volts and then charge up, meaning that we can cram as many oscillations as we want into the waveform period of this clocking oscillator square wave. You get that nice overtone sweep characteristic sound. If I force it into the downcharge position, we end up with sonically the identical thing, but the phase reversal is 180 degrees, so every clock cycle the triangle wave will force a downward charge. Now if I put it into the center, I kind of refer to this as automatic mode, where the Neóni automatically chooses the direction based on the last known direction. So you can see as I adjust the Neóni's frequency around this point, so every hard sync is occurring while the charge is in a positive direction. It means that every half cycle of the waveform, when the direction changes, you end up with this flip-flop, and as it's oscillating every other time between being an up ramp or a down ramp. Meaning that every other cycle you're getting a subharmonic sort of bodged in there and accentuated. Which means that the timbre is much more aggressive. There's that subharmonic that pops a lot more across the range compared to fixed direction. This can be quite nicely demonstrated on a spectrum analyzer, where in the automatic mode you can see as I sweep up, it's getting a sudden jump in fundamental pitch, or fundamental overtone, as the pitch is remaining constant from our clocking signal. So this is accentuating the harmonic overtone series. If I then change to forced direction, you can see there's no longer a sudden jump between overtones, and we get more of a soft crossfade between them. Yeah, extra flavors of hard sync. And we introduce our sequence again. The relationship between the index ratio of clocking frequency and the Neóni's carrier frequency in this context. Different pitches will have different accentuated harmonics if you're in automatic mode. I could also use my sequence to sequence the timbre. And if we control both in parallel, we'll keep a more consistent clocked hard sync tone. Let's move on to our soft sync input on the Neóni. I'm going to keep with the sine wave as our monitored waveform, and I'm going to keep clocking the Neóni from this other Neóni. Let me display this on the second channel, so you can see the frequency that we're soft syncing at. Down a bit so we've got a clearer view of the resulting waveform. The Neóni soft sync is extremely high precision. This is due to the fact that the soft sync capability is fundamental to the through-zero frequency modulation capability, where as the pitch is dropped down towards 0 volts of the modulator, which in turn brings it down towards 0 hertz. It's got the ability to flip the charge direction and therefore the phase of the core signal. But when we're using it in traditional mode, the soft sync is a really high precision charge direction change of the triangle wave. So we can see here every rising edge signal, we're getting a flip in the triangle's charge direction. And sonically, this bears some resemblance to wavefolding in a lot of ways. Very often the soft sync implementation on other triangle wave circuits, there will be a bit of an ignore threshold where maybe centered around 0 volts of the core triangle wave. If it receives a clock during that, it will ignore it. So it's only when the peak is towards the positive and negative extremes, it will then change direction. So that gives more of the classic frequency lock soft sync result, like the TSL is capable of, where you can match it to an integer multiple of the clocking signal, and you'll be able to fine-tune the two voices together without any beat frequencies. The soft sync of the Neóni is much more precise and allows for this much more dramatic wave shaping timbre. What gets quite interesting is when you play with the wavefold output, where you're effectively able to get additional peaks and folds throughout the wave cycle. The index ratio between the two sets the sort of accentuated overtone, and the wavefolder adjusts the spectral timbre a bit more. This can make for some nice voices when you're adding some movement to the patch. LFO movement over the wavefold depth, and I'll add additional movement to the fundamental pitch of our soft synced Neóni. can hold sequence back in. Maybe swap these round so I've got more aggressive movement over the wavefolder. Sync. Let's look at the FM input of the Neóni. It's got a few tricks up its sleeve that are a bit less typical compared to a more vanilla analog oscillator. We'll start simple and just dig into all the various quirks that the module's got. So I'm going to stick with monitoring our sine wave, and I'll clock that from the square wave just to keep consistent visuals on the scope. And I'm going to start with just a manual DC offset, a manual CV control, which is going to be coming from the 1F here. So I'm patching to the FM input, and first off we're going to see that there's an attenuator and a switch that chooses whether the CV input is DC coupled or AC coupled, signified by this capacitor symbol. So if we start DC coupled, this is as traditional as it gets. So correlation between higher the voltage, higher the pitch. This FM input is entirely linear in response over frequency compared to the exponential response of the volt per octave jack. And now you can see as I add a DC offset, the pitch is increasing. If I do the same thing while it's AC coupled, movement of the pitch of the manual CV causes movement in the frequency of the Neóni. So as I increase, the pitch is increasing. As I decrease in voltage, pitch decreases. But as soon as the voltage becomes stationary and becomes just a DC offset, this gets removed by the AC coupling, which is effectively high pass filtering. So it's removing any low frequency content which could be considered as a DC offset. So when this is occurring from a variable voltage, such as this Neóni in LFO range, I'll get to a point where it's a nice musical vibrato. With variable CV and variable voltage, there's not actually a practical difference between the AC and DC behavior. It's only when there's a fixed static DC or anything that's below a certain threshold there'll be a difference in effect. So here we go. So when I'm getting into lower modulation frequency territories, the depth is reduced greatly at the AC mode compared to the DC mode. But over the wider audio range, through all those clangorous analog FM ranges, you might hear a slight difference between the AC and DC in certain index ratios. that would just be due to any natural DC offset or difference in polarity in the modulation signal. So if the sine wave isn't perfectly bipolar, AC coupling will tighten that up to keep it more symmetrical between positive and negative, which even in non-integer multiple index ratios can help add a degree of stability even in atonal sounds. Again, that's entirely dependent upon the index ratio. Cool. Okay, so let's come down and look at this toggle switch, which is below the FM input. So this is an additional routing toggle of the FM modulation source. So if I stick with my sine wave here, I'll keep it there at a vibrato range. If I toggle it to the left position, you'll see there's a symbol that correlates to the hard sync input. So what it does when I engage that, we're actually routing or using this modulation source and deriving a hard sync clock source from it. So the way this happens is the external signal is essentially saturated, and any jump from negative to positive, like the up curve of the sine wave, is going to be turned into a square wave jump, and then that rising hard edge is what will hard sync the Neóni. So if I jump this up to audio rate and then clock it from the clocking Neóni, we're back to our hard sync behavior, which again, the direction choice can be defined. In addition, now I can bring up my FM level and I'm adding a level of periodicity to the carrier Neóni now that's being clocked from the modulator, which means that even in the most atonal clangorous territories, I can hard sync and achieve a periodic tonal waveform. Let's bring our sample and hold sequence back in, and I'm going to sequence the clocking Neóni. This is the non-forced directional hard sync. You can see as I change the amounts of FM depth, we're adding this skewing to the waveform. There's frequency modulation elements introduced to the frequency. And as you can imagine, this can get very interesting when you're using the more complex output waveforms. And if I disengage the hard sync routing, we're into atonal characteristic territory between the modulator and carrier. It's simply adding this hard sync. Of course, the same thing could be achieved by just using the square wave signal of our modulator as the hard sync. does change the timbre somewhat because this is the natural square wave of this modulation sine wave, so the phase alignment of that zero crossing is going to be a little bit different, so it may land on closer to zero crossing in certain instances. But there's something quite nice about the added convenience of just having a single toggle switch to match. Okay, let's look at the next position of this routing toggle, and you see there's an arrow pointing to the right, which actually means it takes a branch of this FM signal, and this comes pre-attenuator and pre-AC/DC switch selection, and routes it to the general purpose CV input. So if I stick with the wavefold output, pop from my primary Neóni again, and let's go back to manual CV. So in this case, it's not going to matter whether I'm AC or DC coupled. I'm going to attenuate that completely, so this no longer affects the fundamental frequency of the oscillator, and I'm going to switch this to the right. And I now have external CV control over the wavefold depth from the same signal, or the same input as the FM input. So again, of course, this could be achieved with a multiple just sending to the same place, but it's a little added convenience if you're modulating externally, and you're able to combine FM and wave shaping timbres from the same modulation source at the flick of a switch. Especially in the wavefold parameter, there's a lot of positions where you just get a little bit of extra brightness addition. And of course, because we have the routing capability between external control over the wavefold depth versus the sawtooth split, we can control additional shaping over the sawtooth wave using the same technique. So here, in parallel, as I increase the voltage, I'm increasing the frequency of the oscillator, while simultaneously changing that sawtooth split wave shape. So there's also an additional quirk to this FM input signal, where I actually have the ability to choose the polarity or charge direction of the fundamental sawtooth wave. So now I've centered the routing toggle switch, so it's not going to hard sync or the general purpose CV input, and I've attenuated the FM signal, so it's no longer affecting the pitch of the oscillator. If I invert my CV, so that instead of it being a positive DC offset, it's going to be a negative DC offset, I've now inverted my sawtooth to a downslope. Sonically, this will have the same spectral makeup, so you won't actually hear the difference between it being an up ramp versus a down ramp, as long as it's the same frequency and amplitude. But this can come in useful in a few different contexts. So especially if you're in LFO territories, you might want to have a modulation signal that is an up ramp, or you might have a down ramp, and you can now choose that via this input jack by just pulling the DC offset one way or the other. Another interesting approach is to use an external signal, like an FM signal that you would use to modulate pitch. And it becomes almost a bizarre form of hard sync. The reason you get these interesting locking timbres is there's edge detection built into this circuit. So even if attenuation's all the way down and there's no additional routing, the polarity change is sensed by the Neóni. So whenever the modulation source changes from negative to positive or positive to negative, it will cue up the change of sawtooth ramp polarity, but it will only implement that change when the sawtooth itself reaches the peaks. That's why in certain ratios you can land on a sometimes stable triangle wave, because you're causing it to clock and fold at a particular timing. The reason for this edge detection polarity shift will become much more prominent when we dig into the through-zero capabilities of the Neóni. But in traditional modes, it gives you a quirky additional wave shaping technique that I don't think I've seen on other analog oscillators. So there is one caveat that you might have spotted. Like, say for instance, for example, I use sine wave and I modulate that somewhere around 4 or 5 hertz or so. So I'm just using it as a more traditional vibrato. Recreate a theremin type sound. If I then want to use the sawtooth wave in place of the sine wave in this context, so I just have slight subtle deviation around the fundamental pitch, I'll have that, but I'll also have the polarity change, like hard flip of the sawtooth occur every time the polarity of the modulator changes. So if I wanted to produce this type of sound but with a cleaner sawtooth wave, there is a trick to achieve that. So for my modulation, if I use my sine wave and I DC offset that either positive or negative, I can do that via the 1F. So I'm patching my modulation sine wave into the second channel of the 1F, and this is now effectively becoming a crossfader between the bipolar modulator and a static DC offset. So somewhere in the middle, and I'm going to have a unipolar positive or some sort of offset modulation source. With the AC coupling engaged, I'm removing that DC offset, and I can readjust my depth. If I now monitor the sawtooth wave, I've achieved stability in only an upper amp sawtooth, or I could even flip the polarity and have the same result, but audibly as a negative sawtooth. So what is through-zero frequency modulation? Beyond just being a controversial topic on discussion forums about what is truly a through-zero FM oscillator versus through-zero phase modulation or through-zero amplitude modulation, it's become a bit of a hot topic, I think, in recent years. And in fact, it's not a new technology at all. I mean, like the references that I think a lot of modern designers use for the through-zero analog circuit is, a lot of them come from the same resources, and these have been documented and in existence from the 70s. Like the Electronotes series have really in-depth tutorials on through-zero FM capable circuits. So the approach that I've used for through-zero frequency modulation is the exact same as that used in a lot of the most popular current analog through-zero FM Eurorack modules. Although, of course, like everyone has their own slight take on it. The way that this in fact does it is when the pitch is dropped down to a low frequency and the modulation signal crosses that 0 volt threshold, to get the phase reversal, like there's a zero crossing detection which checks when the modulation drops either into negative or from negative into positive, and will soft sync the core, so you effectively get that phase reversal of charge direction, and you're effectively able to get positive and negative frequencies from that. But that's maybe me jumping ahead a bit. Let's look at a few things to consider as examples in terms of what is FM, and then how does that differ in practice to through-zero FM. So I'm going to clock my scope from this, and I'll use a pitch that we can use as a sort of stable reference. Let's go with A3, 220 Hz, because that shows up quite nicely as a good couple of cycles on the scope, and on an FFT, I'll bring this in as an overlay, so I'm screen capturing this as I go. We'll see a nice clear spike for this sine wave's fundamental. And now let's FM it. I'm keeping this in traditional at the moment, so we're effectively doing traditional FM, analog FM. So I'm going to use a sine wave here. I'll drop this in the LFO range and DC couple and bring up the depth. So shallower depth, I'll keep this about a musical vibrato range, which is a ballpark 4 Hz or so. So we're in spooky theremin territory. It's almost Halloween. So if I slow this down and increase the depth, what you can see on both the scope and on the FFT we're deviating around a center frequency, which is this A220. And we're going higher, lower, at the rate of the modulation. And this is a bipolar signal that's going through zero volts from positive to negative, which we can see on the LED here. So white is positive, yellow is negative. So we're getting that drift through 0 volts on the modulator, but as this is traditional FM, we're just deviating around a single point. So, although it's just vibrato in this case, which is just a more subtle form of FM, the only difference to that getting into audio rate FM is the range of the modulation frequency. So in this case, the FM algorithm is modulator patched into carrier. So we're monitoring the carrier signal, which we're using to define our fundamental pitch, which is our A220, and we're deviating or modifying that pitch via the modulation signal. So if I bring this up to audio rate, increase the depth, if I bring this down, bring down the depth, we have our static tone, which you can see clearly in the FFT. As I bring the depth up, we can see the peak moving positive and negative around that pitch. Now if I bring the frequency up, as we cross that threshold from low frequency up to audible range, you can see what's happening on the spectrum analyzer. With a lower depth, that fundamental's remaining there, but we're getting what are called sidebands, which are additional pitches or frequencies, overtones that are present, that are symmetrically surrounding that fundamental pitch that's defined by the carrier. And as I increase the index ratio, which is the difference between the modulation frequency and the carrier frequency, I'm affecting the timbre of the resulting waveform. And you can see, especially as I increase this ratio, the frequencies that are lower sidebands, that are below the core carrier frequency, as they get too low and basically cross that 0 hertz point, they bounce back. So they actually flip back into audible range, and you know there's a twin for each overtone. So if I increase the depth, we'll see that more prominently. So there's these two higher spikes that are moving in parallel, as well as the slightly quieter overtones, but they're all related and fixed based on this index ratio. And the reason this sounds clangorous is none of these overtones are harmonically related, so that they're not aligning with the harmonic overtone series based on the fundamental A220 foundation harmonic. The only time you'll get stuff that's harmonically related is if you have an exact matched integer multiple between modulator and carrier frequency, which in analog is achievable. You can get to points where you have harmonic clarity. So if I now clock this from the modulator, I might try and find some stability in the resulting waveform, but it's still clocking all over the place. But as soon as I move away from that integer multiple, we're back to clangorous atonal territory. So that's analog modulator carrier FM frequency modulation. And what we can really take away from this is the fact that the carrier is where we define our fundamental pitch, and the modulator, as we adjust that, it affects timbre. So we have pitch, and timbre. Although there are pitch characteristics that change with the timbre, but there's still that core foundation harmonic from the carrier. So let's jump into thru-zero FM territory and see what we come up with. The way I'm going to demonstrate this is with a manual CV. I'm going to DC couple my FM input, bring the pitch down, and so this is a 0 to 10 volt manual CV. And what I'm going to do, I've got positive CV in, we're still listening to the sine wave, and I'm clocking it from the square wave of the scope. I'll get back to my A3 220 Hz, just for reference. So I'm now starting at a DC positive at the FM input to get my core foundation pitch. And as I bring this down to 0 volts, I basically brought the oscillator down to LFO territories. So we can see on the spectrum analyzer, we're going from our defined fundamental, and that's pitching all the way down to, closer to 0. It's maybe not going to exactly hit 0 because I would need to bring this down to stall it. And even then, this core circuit might never stall completely, but for practical purposes, it's enough. It's well below what we can hear. And if you're modulating this at audio rate, which is how you would actually utilize thru-zero FM, then there's never going to be any time where you would hear 0 hertz, or it would effectively stall. So to mimic our bipolar modulation source, I'm going to manually bring this down, flip the phase of this, so this is now going to be a negative bias. I bring this back up, this is now minus 10 volts, and what you can see is we're back at our A220 sine tone, which you can also see on the spectrum analyzer. So as I bring that down, go back to positive, bring it back up, or I can even just jump directly. So I'm going from positive 10 volts, negative 10 volts. And you see there's a little blip on the spectrum analyzer as this is changing direction. So we're essentially soft syncing this whenever this crosses 0. So that's what's happening with through-zero frequency modulation is, as we go to a negative voltage, we've brought the pitch back up to our defined audible frequency, but it's technically a negative frequency, even though the scope doesn't care, the FFT analyzer doesn't care. Like, it's just looking at a sine wave. It doesn't have anything to reference it to. So the only time that we actually have any relevance between the negative sine wave versus the positive sine wave, or whatever waveform we're using on the Neóni, it always needs to be occurring fast enough that there's something relevant for it to be compared to. So let's see how we can produce that effect. I'm going to use the sine wave from the second Neóni. I'll bring this down to LFO ranges, and I'm going to patch this in here. So I've essentially got an additional attenuator, but it's useful because we can visualize it on this LED here. So what I've done now, I've brought up the fundamental pitch so that the positive and negative target peaks of this modulation sine wave are hitting approximately my A220 target pitch. To show this even more clearly, I can even run this signal through the scope. So we're now seeing on the yellow trace our modulation signal, which is a sine wave, and as it crosses through 0, we're getting to that 0 hertz point where the phase reversal occurs of the core triangle wave, which means that we've got a difference in phase polarity between the positive peak and the negative peak. Now, we don't see this on the scope, of course, because we're clocked from the square wave, and it's just aligning the visualization based on what it's receiving. So again, it doesn't care whether it's positive or negative, but we know it's positive versus negative based on the control voltage source that's going into it. So now what happens as I bring this up and enter audio rate territories? We see a very different result than the equivalent analog FM modulator carrier here. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to engage the AC coupling, which is going to remove any minute deviations between the positive and negative frequency targets, because for this to function properly, we need the positive and negative peaks to be symmetrical. So here we go. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to tune my modulator, which is now the yellow sine wave we're seeing on the scope. I'll clock that from here, in fact. And I'm going to tune that to what was my previous target frequency, which is a 220. Or thereabouts. So now I've flipped the roles of these oscillators. Even though this is still modulator and this is still carrier, I'm now defining my fundamental frequency at the modulator as opposed to the carrier. So if I change this, I'm going to be changing the fundamental pitch that I'm hearing. If I now change the index ratio of modulator and carrier by changing the carrier signal, you can see it's staying as a periodic signal, and on the spectrum analyzer you'll see that we have our foundation pitch, and as I bring up the frequency of the carrier, there's no fluid motion of the, what would have been sidebands previously. It's just a shift in amplitude across the spectrum. One of the primary takeaways that I try to describe when I'm teaching synthesis and covering different variations of frequency modulation, specifically with through-zero frequency modulation, you reverse the roles of the carrier modulator, where traditionally you would normally set the foundation pitch at the carrier, so carrier defines pitch and modulator defines timbre. The roles are completely reversed in a through-zero frequency modulation operator pair. In a lot of ways, the way that I try to describe this process is effectively, it is frequency modulation. There is modulation of the frequency of an oscillator happening as part of the procedure, but in practice, it's so far removed from that previous clangorous traditional operator pair, the modulator carrier, sideband inducing algorithm to through-zero, that this Neóni is now no longer performing as an oscillator. It's taken on the role of complex wave shaper, or it looks very similar to wavefolding as the peaks are folding in and out. But this occurs infinitely over the frequency range of this carrier oscillator. So I always find it sits a bit more organically than wavefolding because you get slight deviations in the movement, especially if there are any like just slight DC offsets between the modulation signal. If it was slightly asymmetrical, that would translate to movement, which can be very musical. You can get that sort of really subtle balancing. So this Neóni is now no longer an oscillator, it's an infinite wavefolder. But then you also need to remember the fact that there is a wavefolder built into the oscillator itself, so we now have the ability to wavefold an infinitely foldable signal. If we go back to our FM input, additional routing, I can introduce additional wave shaping elements by using the same modulation signal to control the wavefold depth. So without additional patching, I've got additional timbre controls. If I go back to the sine wave, you can clearly hear the difference between the DC coupling of the FM input. So that means that even the smallest non-symmetrical offset between the positive and negative voltage peaks of this modulation signal, if they're not perfectly symmetrical to hit the symmetrical positive and negative target frequencies of the carrier, we get into more clangorous atonal spectrums. So if we look at the spectrum analyzer again, you can see there's that similarity to traditional FM, where there's pairs of sidebands that move in parallel together. Not quite as dramatically, there's still a more tonal center in this context, I think. But at the flick of a switch, the Neóni will automatically center and align the symmetry. So that's the difference. Through-Zero FM, non-through-zero FM. Clangorous tones, tonal tones. So yeah, the primary takeaway that I would really draw attention to is the role reversal of traditional FM where the carrier defines frequency and the modulator defines timbre. So carrier, frequency, modulator, timbre, and through zero, the roles have completely flipped. So now modulator is pitch, carrier is timbre. Let's dive a bit deeper into some of the other wave shape capabilities when using thru-zero FM on the Neóni. Just to get back to a reference, I'm going to modulate the frequency from this other Neóni. There we go. I'll clock the scope from the modulator as well, so we've got a consistent waveform on the scope. So first up, if we look at the routing toggle underneath the FM jack, this can be used to add a bit of extra stability. So occasionally, depending on how balanced the modulator into carrier is, so here AC coupling's on, but there might still be a bit of drift and movement on the wave shape. So sometimes you might want that to lock in really rigidly, and with the flick of a switch you can achieve that. A lot of the times it's quite nice just having that slightly organic movement to the wave shaping, which sort of sets the thru-zero FM timbre apart from more static wavefolding. One caveat is that there can be a bit of a zipper sound when there's movement between the index ratio. So that's due to the hard sync point coming on a non-zero crossing, or at the fold point. So that's due to the square wave that's been derived from this FM sine wave it's in line directly, so it's not the natural square wave phase difference between sine wave and square wave. This patch could actually be done by using the natural square wave of your modulator as the clock source. And here we've got a perfectly static resulting waveform, which is perfectly symmetrical now for infinite wavefolding. And the reason for this is because the hard sync point falls naturally on a zero crossing, compared to here where we actually have the hard sync mid-cycle in comparison to the natural square wave. So that's kind of 3 degrees of stability. We've got the no locking, where you can get a bit of organic movement, which can be nice. Flick of a switch, you can lock that in, but there can be a slight tearing artifact. Or you could use the natural square of your modulator to lock things in really tightly and balanced. So what we can do to compare things at this stage, try different modulation waveforms. So that's the triangle wave versus the sine wave, which is quite a subtle difference. There's maybe more clarity in the triangle wave, because there's no slowing down in the charge direction during the curvature of the sine wave. It's always keeping a consistent velocity. The sawtooth wave gets interesting. There's a much more direct peak. I think there's maybe a bit more of a nasally character with the sawtooth as a modulation signal. It's an extra squelchiness. What I'll do, I'll bring my underclocked triangle sample and hold patch back in and use that as a sequence. Timbre, the best way to get a good range of control is to attenuate any modulation source you might want over the pitch. This is now triangle LFO going into volt per octave, and using the 1F to attenuate that down, so I'm controlling the depth of timbre shift. Another option similar to how you might use a more traditional modulator carrier FM pair, similar to how you might use hardsync as well, is track both oscillators, both carrier and modulator from the same parallel sequence. You can obtain a bit more consistency in waveform per pitch. Sawtooth wave. I can also play with the, because I'm using the Neóni as a modulator, I can play with the sawtooth split. Modulation over the sawtooth split of the modulator, which is through-zero frequency modulating this Neóni as carrier. Quite a nice range of movement there. Let's try the square wave as our modulation source. I'll keep it clocked and then I'll patch via the scope. So what you might notice here, if I kill the sequence for a moment, this might look look familiar from earlier in the video. So this is square wave used from this as a modulator into this carrier as a thru-zero FM configuration. The resulting waveform is actually identical to that of the carrier being in traditional mode and the square wave being used to soft sync. So traditional soft sync from a clocking oscillator is in effect the same as thru-zero FM using a square wave as a modulation signal. So here is one of the primary reasons I put a lot of effort into getting the wavefolder output to be a very consistent amplitude over its fold range. Let's use the wavefolder as my modulation source. Take this modulation out so that we've not got any movement over the carrier frequency. During any movement of the wavefold depth, you get a lot of interesting atonal movement, and then as soon as the modulator becomes static, it stabilizes. So if I'm clocking this from the square wave. So this is again quite interesting with the internal hard sync engaged. Because our modulation signal is actually crossing thru-zero multiple times, as it's a folded signal of the fundamental pitch. When we hard sync, there are more sync points. So I end up with more points across the waveform that stay rigid. This is a nice patch when there's a bit of movement to the wavefold depth of the modulator. The movement is quite reminiscent of some wavetable synthesis, because there's a lot of rigidity in the periodicity of the waveform. Not just movement in the makeup of it. Sequence back in. And this is a really nice rich waveform that could suit being low pass filtered. Let's use this as our new rich voice for a subtractive patch. hard sync disengaged, you get a lot more movement in the foundation waveform, especially when there's motion on the wavefolder. I've added natural hard sync from the natural square wave of the modulator. It constricts the movement closer to being within the waveform period of the clocking oscillator. Wide range of timbres that are achievable through thru-zero just by changing up the modulation waveforms. That's before we even get into utilising the wavefolded output. So this is a wavefolded modulation signal thru-zero FMing that carrier that is then being wavefolded to the output. I've not looked at yet. Let's return to pre-filter. The square wave output when the Neóni is thru-zero FM. You get interesting layers of effectively pulse width modulation within the period cycle of the clocking oscillator, or the modulator. So this is using the natural square wave of the modulator to soft sync the carrier in the FM configuration. And it accentuates a subharmonic. As I guess there's an additional frequency change, so not just the phase inversion that comes with the thru-zero element. There's an additional instability. Quite different from utilising the hard sync locking. In this case, both hard syncing from the unnatural square wave and soft syncing from the natural. modify this patch a little bit more and go back to sine wave modulated from the sine wave in thru-zero mode. So an extra benefit of the internal hard sync is that at the flick of a switch you can then jump between thru-zero mode, where this is the carrier as a thru-zero FM oscillator, and switch that to traditional. And because it's hard synced from the modulator, we retain the modulator as behaving as the defining the core frequency. So the resulting waveform, even though it's traditional analog FM and not thru-zero, remains the waveform remains periodic. Stop the sequence temporarily. This is hard synced analog FM versus thru-zero FM. If I take the hard sync off, we'll hear a sort of comparison between clangorous analog FM versus the tonal thru-zero. So these index ratios actually don't have a lot in common fundamentally, because when you're in traditional mode, the carrier frequency defines your fundamental pitch, and then the modulator frequency is timbre over it, and then you immediately flip to utilizing the modulation frequency as your fundamental. So what I did during development of this module, I curated the ranges of the fundamental pitch control over the Neóni to correlate somewhat naturally between spectral content. When you make this jump between thru-zero to traditional, the ratios are changing, the index ratios are changing dramatically as the offset that's introduced between these two modes, it pushes the fundamental pitch of the Neóni as carrier into a different range. But spectrally I tried to match as best I could so that you were getting a similar harmonic makeup between the two FM modes. The result being quite effective when you use the hard sync engagement. So you're changing from a softer, purer thru-zero timbre to the harsher, hard synced analog FM version. As a final section, I want to show some of the interesting ways that the Neóni can be used in LFO mode. That might differ from other LFO modules that are out there. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to use this Neóni in thru-zero mode and create a patch where I'm using it as a sort of woody, percussive, plucked sound. And to do that, I will use this TSL as my modulator. So this will be defining the pitch. So modulator carrier in through-zero mode, this defines pitch, and my carrier defines timbre. To keep things visually clean, I'll clock the scope from the modulator. So for this patch, I'm going to be enveloping the volt per octave to give me nice, quick exponential strikes over the index ratio, which in this case is acting more like wavefold depth. If we're considering the thru-zero FM timbre as more of a wavefold type configuration. So let's use the cease here. I'll use the 1F here as an attenuator. Push that to volt per octave. Bring my carrier pitch down. There we go. So if I were to clock that from here, I think it has a more organic texture than simply striking a wavefolder because of the natural fluctuation you get between the analog index ratio and thru-zero FM. Okay, so to create some sort of melodic pattern, I'm going to use the harmony as my quantizer. I'll keep with the minor pentatonic we've been using so far. And I'm going to quantize the various outputs of this Neóni acting as an LFO. So I have it set to traditional mode and LFO range. So we're basically taking the traditional behavior and dropping it into LFO territories. There will be potentially some quirky behaviors depending on control scheme configuration if you have it in thru-zero and LFO, or even just running in thru-zero mode and monitoring that at audio rates. Depending on the AC or DC coupling, how things are routed, there can be internal essentially feedback signals that can determine pitch. So rule of thumb, if you're looking for a more traditional behavior of an oscillator, stick it in traditional mode, in which case LFO acts as a more traditional LFO. So let's start with the triangle wave. And I'm going to use the gate output of the harmony, which is just producing triggers on a new note in this setup. And I'll clock my envelope from that. Strike a nice balance of so as it's a trigger signal, the decay is going to be quite short, so I can use that for an initial more aggressive impulse, and then use the release time as the actual tail of the percussive pluck. And I can set the starting amount of upper harmonic timbre via the carrier frequency. Okay, so this is LFO being quantized triangle wave. So we're getting an ascending and descending arpeggio. So we've looked at hard sync and soft sync in audio rate context for this. In LFO range, the LED button here, which by default displays the amplitude of the triangle wave, regardless of a audio rate range or LFO range, this button actually serves as a manual soft sync button, which in LFO mode is quite an interesting feature for being able to immediately change the charge direction of the chord triangle. So I can use this to manually limit where the direction changes. Let's change things up and use the sawtooth wave. Reduce the depth of the signal at the harmony. And I've got the sawtooth shaper fully anti-clockwise, so this is going to be a natural ascending sawtooth wave. Now changing a ratio split for the ramp. It becomes quite useful for building melodic devices where you can have, you know, part of an ascending line and then the second half. I'm going to use this 1F down here and just use the polarity switch to control a DC offset going to the FM input here. So now, as we know, if it's a positive CV seen at the FM input, it keeps the sawtooth wave as an ascending ramp. But if that turns negative, after that change at the next high peak of the sawtooth wave, it will change direction. So I'm essentially queuing up on the next full cycle that will change direction of the sawtooth wave. So to automate that, I could just use a slow LFO, pick a variation of the modulator's waveform. Next is use an additional LFO and use that to modulate the sawtooth split. So I'll add a bit more variation to the ratio of the two portions of the LFO sawtooth wave. So I'll now switch to using the wavefolder as the modulation source. It gets a little bit extreme in terms of the rate in between the fold points. But when using that as, in different patch contexts where it might be over different timbre parameters, especially when this is in really low frequency territories, it means that during the single up ramp side of a triangle wave, the wavefolder will be cycling back and forth multiple times. To wrap things up, I'm going to show a quirky little patch I came across when experimenting with self-patching of the Neóni. So this one, other than the output patch cable that's coming from the triangle wave in this case, this only uses 2 patch cables. So I'm going to patch the sine wave input to the wavefold depth CV and have that switch set to the wavefolder. And then I'm going to patch the wavefold output to the FM input and AC couplet So this is in traditional mode and no LFO engaged. And as you can see, the result is various bird sounds. It's quite a temperamental patch, but playing about with additional levels of wavefold depth modulation. There's a nice range of cheeps and chirrups. So if ever you're in need of bird sounds for whatever reason, Neóni can do it with 2 patch cables. Thanks for watching.